Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Namaste. Sat Sri Akal from Lahore. Welcome to the fourth season of Sunday Stories Live. I'm very excited and a bit saddened, and I'll tell you why for this particular series because today is our last presentation for season 4 that we have in Sunday Stories Live. So very excited about this, but I'm sad that it will be over, and something that I've really enjoyed and learned a lot. So my name is Furrukh Khan, and I will be your MC for today's event. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this episode where we'll be conversing with a great scholar, Professor Ian Talbot. This event series will be taking place every Sunday, but I mean, not right now, maybe when we have the fifth season around. So hopefully that will be on Sunday as well. A little bit about me. I've been working and teaching partition since 2001 at Lahore University of Management Sciences. But again, it is something which is much more than academic pursuit for me, because my mother's family came from a village called Kalupur in Gurdaspur. I've been involved with 1947 Partition Archive over the last few years, and they document the nearly lost history of partition. The flagship oral history project is the largest of its kind in South Asia and has so far documented more than 10,000 stories. You can learn more about this by visiting the archive's website or speaking to any one of the team members who are here. So, today it's my honor to continue the Sunday Stories live tradition and facilitate what I believe will be a fascinating conversation with Professor Ian Talbot. Let's welcome him, send him a like or a heart, since we can't really hear your clapping at the moment. So, a little bit about him before we formally, or before we start the interview formally. Professor Ian Talbot is the Emeritus Professor of Modern South Asian History at the University of Southampton, where he was formerly Head of History, Director of the Center for Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies, and Director of Humanities Graduate Program. He has published and researched extensively in the fields of Colonial Punjab History, the 1947 Partition of India, and History of Pakistan. His work on partition, and again, he's published much more widely, but here I will just limit it to partition. His work on partition include Divided Cities, Partition and Its Aftermath in Lahore and Amritsar, 1947 to 57, and the Partition of India. This was with Professor Gurharpal Singh. His first major publication, Punjab and the Raj, set the region's division in the wider sweep of colonial administration of the province. The book was republished in 2021 in the Manohar Classics series. His other most recent publications include The History of British Diplomacy in Pakistan, History of Modern South Asia, Politics, States, Diasporas, with Professor Tahir Kamran, and Lahore in the time of Raj, the Raj. Okay. So with that, and forget, sorry, he was my external for my when I did my PhD, so 20 years ago. So Professor Talbot, so wonderful to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time and for speaking with us, and I'm really, really honored to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Same here. So again, I mean, first things first. When did you become aware of partition, and how did it kind of maybe become an academic interest? Was there any kind of personal history, or how did you end up working on partition all those years ago?
Unlike a lot of people of my generation, I didn't, as a British academic or British student, I didn't have any family links in India as such. Although I grew up, I suppose, within a sort of environment in which there was great interest in India, particularly because I was brought up in Portsmouth in Hampshire, on the south coast of England, which was very much an area that Mountbatten, the last viceroy, was associated with. Many roads were named after him. He was frequently in the news. And indeed, my father, who served in the Royal Navy, and Portsmouth was a great naval city, was in Singapore in September 1945 when the Japanese surrendered to Mountbatten. So I grew up in this sort of atmosphere of knowing about the British Empire, about Mountbatten, before I actually studied Indian history when I was at university. And obviously when I was at London University in the 1970s, one of the areas in which I specialized in was the history of India. And I was very fortunate to be taught by Francis Robinson, who was a leading scholar even in those days and became even more prominent in his studies on Indian Muslims. And it was really from taking his courses that I began to develop an interest in India from the perspective not just of the Raj, but also of Indian Muslim experience and the circumstances in which Pakistan was created and in which the partition came about. So that's really the context, for my academic career on the partition.
Okay. And academics studying partition have used different assumptions because partition continues to be a very kind of controversial, is even a mild way of putting this. And they've used different assumptions and perspectives to understand this particular phenomenon. And having worked on this subject, as our title suggests, for more than 4 decades, what have been your key findings in those last 40 years? I know it is tough to have to give you such a short time, but just if you could just kind of touch on those.
I think one of the things which has certainly come out in the various books and articles I've published is the complexities as well as the controversies surrounding partition, and the fact that the events may have been experienced very differently in different parts of a single province, not just of a region across India. And that whilst there is a sort of universal high politics story, if you start to look at partition on the ground, so to speak, and more the social history of partition rather than the political history as to why it might have happened and what was the role of the great players, people like Mountbatten, like Gandhi, like Nehru, like Jinnah, like Master Tahir Singh representing the Sikh community. If you go beyond that and start to look at how partition was experienced at the grassroots, you'll see that there were very different events, very different experiences, and those were based on localities and on communities, on class, caste, and that really, I suppose my work in a sense was there to complicate what could be a very simple narrative, either of partition in the role of a particular individual or what caused it, and I think that my work was part of this digging deeper and making things more complex and more nuanced. Yet I thought that in itself was important because it helped to break down stereotypes, narratives, which could too easily put all the blame on one particular community, one particular individual. And I think what my work has been showing, is that you just can't make those kind of assumptions. That what we're dealing with here is something which is obviously very controversial and still is today, but is also very complex, and has to be approached in that manner. And I think that it's been important, and I've certainly been fortunate to be able to work both in India and in Pakistan in archives, and particularly to travel extensively in both Punjabs, and to in itself help to produce perhaps a more balanced understanding, of what happened. I'm not saying that it's able to totally understand every complexity or every truth about partition, but I think it's important to not get caught up into highly politicized and stereotypical presentations of what happened. So I think that's probably where my work has contributed. And obviously it's happened alongside a totally transformed scholarship on partition. When I set out, back in the 70s in my work, there was no such thing as partition studies. It didn't exist as a body of work. And if you'd use those terms in those days, people wouldn't have known what you were talking about. Things have been transformed, both methodologically in terms of the availability of sources, what are seen as source materials. We've moved on from documents, to oral history. That really wasn't there so much when I started out on my work. So that the way in which history is understood, the sources are used, have been transformed. And obviously in recent times, the technology, how these are recorded, how we access material. I remember, when I was doing research, even for Divided Cities volume, where I was still traveling around with a tape recorder, interviewing people in Lahore and in Amritsar about their experiences of partition. And obviously that was very different, to the ways in which you might do this research today. And of course you didn't have any means other than perhaps transcripts, of interviews. Everything today is much quicker, more instantaneous, and certainly you weren't in those days able to share your findings as rapidly as you can do today. So I think that the 4 decades that I've been engaged in this have really been transforming how we research partition, and how we understand it, and the perspectives that we bring to it.
So again, and my question, you kind of the follow-up question that I had in mind, but as a scholar, you've already kind of addressed that, which is that there had to be some core differences which needed to be kept in mind when one was examining the simultaneous events of independence and partition, and you've kind of touched on that. But what I will add to that is that you, amongst I think so many other scholars, were so fortunate enough to, because you were able to move both, as you kind of already mentioned, India and Pakistan. How in that, and you must have spoken with other people who were working on partition, how do you think your perspective added because of the opportunities which were there, because of how uniquely you were placed?
I think that I was very fortunate in being able to work on both sides of the border, and that certainly it's much more difficult for people to get visas to be able to work either in India if you're coming from Pakistan, or vice versa. So if you're just looking at one particular region, you may not be deliberately telling a distorted version of the past, but you're very much dealing with a partial version of what's happened, so that you could be looking at patterns of migration or violence, and obviously one particular community would be victims of that, and another community might be aggressors. But if you went over the border, the situation would be reversed, and that would be the reality of it. So I think that the ability to look at both sides of Punjab and what's happening is very important, because it can help break down stereotypical views that it's all the fault of one particular community for what happens. You see a much more variegated pattern, and I think that's important. And being able to have access, to interview people, to collect sources, across both sides of the divided Punjab, or divided Bengal for that matter, really gives you an opportunity to have a more holistic understanding of partition and all the varieties of experience which people had.
Another thing which kind of again is connected to the research you carried out, and I think like with partition, so often it's not just the academic work, it's who you are as the academic's own subjectivity, I think more often than not becomes a center point before his or her work is looked at. And you as a British scholar, because there was kind of, the time period that one is talking about in the 80s and 90s, the emergence of post-colonial studies, that there were these new ways of, looking at history, looking at cultural studies, all that. And how did that kind of, as far as the receiving of your particular work is concerned, did that play? Were you kind of seen as a representation, or was your stance, were people who were critical of the stance that you had? If you could talk about that.
Yes, sure. I think the first thing to bear in mind is that historians should try to be objective, but all historians as human beings are brought up in a particular cultural framework, which is going to influence them, if only subconsciously. And I think that that's an important point to bear in mind. I think that what sort of post-colonial studies has done is to make people reflect far more, perhaps, on how we use sources and whether the sources that you're using are not perhaps in themselves telling a particular bias story, and the need to deconstruct the material and to be critical as far as you can be, of the source material, whether it's documents or even whether it's you're talking to people. Because I think one of the things which is true to an extent, but could be exaggerated, is that if you go in for oral history narratives rather than documents, that these somehow or other are truer, and that they're not going to have the biases built into them that, say, a governor of a province might have, when they're writing about a particular situation. But you're dealing, as I say, again, with human beings. So if you're talking to people who experience partition, they're going to have their own agendas, what they tell you, what they don't tell you. Sometimes the silences may be more important than actually what is being said. So that just because you're handling a different kind of material, oral sources as opposed to documents, that doesn't mean to say necessarily that that's automatically going to enable you to have a less biased view of what is happening. So I think the awareness of the need to be reflective is something which certainly has increased during the course of my academic career and research. And I think that is important for all historians, whatever topic you happen to be addressing.
And one of the things which kind of came to mind as you were speaking is, again, this move towards the social history. But again, even in my own little bit of work that I have done, which is that one has spoken with people, the focus is, as far as partition is concerned, on people who were affected by this, the people who were natives of India. But are there, or have you conducted interviews of the common, the average people who represent the empire, not necessarily in great positions of authority, but ordinary Britishers who were here in 1947? And again, like, as I said, like, this is just something which kind of is coming to mind, that post-coloniality tries to bring in figures who are kind of on the margins, but this would be a curious case of the Britishers, that you would have their representation in the written record, but as far as the oral narrative is concerned, that is so much focused on, say, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, other people who were affected by this.
Yes, I think that that's a very important point that you're making. My own research hasn't necessarily focused on that, but if you did interview, and there have been interviews made with certainly British lower ranked soldiers, and also people who were not civil servants at all, and their views and experiences again would be very different, and this is in keeping, with this whole trend, which is to say that there is high differentiation between the understandings, the perspectives, the experiences of partition across those people who were present at the time. And that really what's happening, I think, with more sources becoming available, is we're becoming aware of that, and how perhaps the earlier narratives were very much reflective of an elite perspective. Whether it's political elites, in the case of the British, or those involved with politics from an Indian perspective, or whether it's the experience even of refugees, where most of the interviews have tended to be taken, with people from a more privileged background, and the same with those British who were there in India. And indeed, I think one of the things which does come out, if you look at British people in India, is that some British people were very much uprooted by partition, and some of them were impoverished as a result of the partition experience, and actually had to be almost sort of rescued after independence, by the British High Commissions in India and Pakistan, and provide them with the money that they could have to return on the ship to the UK. So that there's no universal experience on the British side, or if you look at any community, it's much more broken down than that.
And again, to our audience, you're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. Professor Ian Talbot is our guest. My name is Furrukh Khan, and we are looking at Professor Talbot's 40 years of research on this particular subject. We will soon be moving to getting questions and comments from our audience. So please put them in the comment box, and we will definitely choose some of them, and then we'll ask Professor Talbot about them. So as someone who's been working on the both sides, in India and Pakistan, what kind of a shadow, the long shadow, as someone has called it, does partition continue to cast now that, of course, you said that you've been working on it for 40 years, but partition has had more than 70 years. As not an outsider, but maybe someone who's not from here, and someone who's studying this, what kind of an impact have you seen throughout your academic career, the shadow of partition on India and Pakistan?
I think that at society level, what has become more and more clear over the years is that this wasn't something which was done and dusted in August 1947. That families were uprooted, and it may have taken a generation or more, or perhaps never fully recovered from the trauma involved with that uprooting. And that some people were able to get back on an even keel. Others, it took them many, many years, and there wasn't one single migration often. That came out with some of the interviews that I was doing for the book, The Epicenter of Violence, that people may have migrated to one place and then moved on to somewhere else, and some of them even went overseas as a result of that. I mean, what is quite interesting is, and perhaps we'll pick this up towards the end, about how students today look at partition, but certainly families who migrated to the diaspora as a result of partition, that was a profound upheaval, and that has influenced both their understanding of their past and also perhaps some of the scholarship which is now emerging. So it's a long-term influence for people within society. There are winners and losers, as there are in any situation. Some people were able to recover their losses because of the connections which they might have had previously to regions where they migrated, or because of their ability to work networks and to gain state support or support from within their community. Others were never able to do so. So that's a long shadow and a long trauma if a family never really recovers from the uprooting experience, the material losses, as well as the psychological trauma. If we're looking at the state level, then obviously partition has played a role in the production of state narratives relating to the South Asia region. And that in itself can sort of encourage perhaps a sense of mistrust between the states, as well as between communities within the two states, which again is a long shadow. And I think that that's important to bear in mind. I'm not saying that partition has been the only factor, say, in the difficult Indo-Pakistan relationship since 1947, but it's certainly been a factor which cannot be ignored and overlooked in terms of how these two countries, which are neighbors with very similar cultural traditions, a shared history of colonial rule, yet have been called by some people distant neighbors, and have been in a sometimes hot war and often a long-standing Cold War with each other. So that's a profound influence of partition. But as I say, it's not the only factor in this mistrust, but it's there, and it's seen in so many areas of life, isn't it? In terms of ability of people to cross easily across the border one way or the other, families which are still not reunited and can't meet with each other, the difficulties then of visas, of people-to-people contact, trade, limitation of trade. It goes through sometimes more positive phases at the Wagga border, but nonetheless, if you think about these two countries and their populations and the possible synergies of trade between them and the advantages which that would bring, this is not able to come to fruition. And it's partly because of this history of mistrust, which dates back to the partition. So I think that there are some profound shadows, which are still there and really need to be lifted if these countries are going to fulfill, their full economic potential.
Thank you. again, to the audience, I will probably just ask one more question, and then we'll kind of start going through the comments and questions that you may have. So you are watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. Professor Ian Talbot is our guest. My name is Furrukh Khan, and this is like, again, I have other questions, but I mean, maybe the last one before we move over is that as someone who's worked on partition for such a long time, you must have interacted with almost kind of more than one generation of students in different parts of the world, in terms of, say, in Britain, in India, in Pakistan. How, I mean, have the students, have the new generation, which obviously has not been privy to what it is that has happened as far as the maybe first-hand experience of partition is concerned, but the knowledge of partition, how much of an importance is given to partition? Does it kind of continue to play an important role as it does for both the states or for the people who went through it? I mean, what has been your take on this particular subject through your interaction with young people?
I think that young people are interested in partition and why it happened and how it may have affected their communities. It's certainly the case in the UK that when you teach students from a South Asian background, that they're very interested. They may have some set ideas which have come from their family, which you question them with, but they may have never really had many discussions about partition at home, but they're fascinated in wanting to find out more about it. And I think that this has been reflected also in a new generation of scholars of partition. Certainly, I can think of scholars I know who came from a partition background. And of course, this is very much likely to be the case in the UK, because with the large Punjabi, Bengali, Kashmiri communities in the UK, these are all the regions which were perhaps most adversely affected by partition. So inevitably, there's going to be some people from those communities whose families were affected. So they have a desire and an interest to find out about that, perhaps firstly as students, and then perhaps later as scholars of partition. And I think a lot of the work now is actually being driven by the diaspora South Asian community. And this was very much evident in the 70th anniversary of partition. I don't know whether the BBC's documentaries were shown in the subcontinent so much, but certainly there were a number of programs which were all around the theme in the UK of people returning home, their ancestral home, and retracing the steps which their family may have had, in 1947. So this reconnection with the partition experience from the diaspora, I think, was very much a marked feature of how partition was being presented in the UK, particularly nearly 5 years ago now. So that I think that there's going to be more interest in partition, certainly amongst the diaspora. I'm not quite so sure in terms of within the India and Pakistan context. One, I don't have quite so many interactions with students, but two, I can imagine there might be some who have not been personally affected, their families affected, and thinking, why we're harking back to this? Why don't we move on to something else? But certainly, I don't think that there's an exhaustion of interest in partition.
Absolutely. Thank you. again, so what we will do is that we will go to our audience, and we already have a comment is from Nidhi. Your work on partition is tremendous. Glad to hear you live. So obviously she's talking about you. Thank you very much, Nidhi. And again, I mean, I share those sentiments as well, because I think like after 2000 and maybe year 2000, this is like we I don't know met what once or twice, but so this is my first extended interaction with Professor Talbot as well. So I completely agree with the sentiments. Purna Chaudhary says, I would be interested to know how class and caste impacted the partition.
That's a very good and interesting question. And I think that one of the things to bear in mind is that obviously people from all caste and class backgrounds could end up as terrible victims of the dislocation and the violence. And just because you came from a particular high caste or class, you weren't immune to the suffering which people had. But certainly work on refugee resettlement for those people who made it over the border one way or the other. It indicates that the more social capital that you brought, in other words, your education, your connections, your awareness of how to work systems, and that's important if you're going to have to deal with the local state for compensation for the losses. The more social capital that you had, then the more likely it was that you would be able to retrieve some of your losses, material losses anyway, if not overcome the psychological trauma that accompanied partition. And the other thing which is interesting, which recent research, partly my own, but lots of other people have done it as well, is that how the state itself, both the Indian state and the Pakistan state, differentiated between communities in terms of provision of facilities for resettlement of refugees, in terms of the kind of house, the size of the house, and plot that was allocated to you would be determined by your standing and wealth prior to partition, so that there was a reproduction of the hierarchies to an extent by the state itself, as well as individuals' ability to work the system dependent on their class and education level. In terms of caste, for example, the work of someone like Ravinder Kaur on refugee resettlement in Delhi has shown that untouchables were treated differently to other castes and had their own separate sort of camps and own separate sort of accommodation provisions when they were migrants across from Pakistan. So again, you're reproducing to a certain extent existing social hierarchies. I'm not saying that all individuals, were able to maintain their social hierarchy as a result of partition. As I said, there were losers as well as winners in this process. But on the whole, I think how you were able to pick up the threads of your life after migration did depend to a large extent on what your position was before you were forced to uproot and migrate from your home. So that's really, I think, a key element, and how class and caste sort of was impacted by partition and its immediate aftermath. But obviously, you could pick out, cases which might not be exceptions to this.
Okay, thank you. Haris Farooq asks, my question is, how could we have avoided bloodshed, looting, and forced migration of communal groups? Thanks for having such a great discussion. So, yes, so look into your magic mirror and say, tell us how this could have been avoided.
I mean, I think that it was probably impossible to avoid dislocation in the circumstances in which partition occurred, with a breakdown of law and order, with certainly, and here I'm going to be critical of Mountbatten, who I mentioned right at the beginning, of inadequate security arrangements. The Punjab boundary force was certainly not up to the task that it had to undertake. So better security arrangements would have been a factor, certainly, in this. But I think that it probably would have been impossible given the extreme polarization of society.
And even the scale of in the numbers that one was looking at.
Well, that's right. I mean, the colonial state had obviously had experience in dealing with communal conflict, but this was mainly in an urban context where police forces could be sort of deployed. In the rural context, it would be much more difficult. And some of the greatest violence was obviously in rural areas after the partition itself, although there had been considerable violence in cities like Lahore and Amritsar, you know, as I show in my book, you know, in the lead up to partition. So that those are, I think, important factors. And also perhaps we've got to be critical not just of security arrangements, but of the fact that there were certainly a coming together, you know, of those people who wanted opportunistically to loot and to seize property, and to do that through force, and this sort of great political conflict and breakdown in sort of, as I say, functioning law and order, and breakdown of trust. And I think it's this combination of what we might call the public background to partition and the private motivations, you know. And some, of course, local level politicians did employ goondas to kill members of other communities to serve their local turf wars and local political interests. You know, so it's a whole range of issues coming together. And one final point, which I think is important to bear in mind, to say how could there have been security that would have prevented this, is that political parties had established paramilitary organizations, and these had grown quite rapidly. And you know, and that's even Congress, which was supposed to be, you know, wedded to the non-violent philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. You know, there were paramilitary organizations. There was planning behind some of the violence. You know, and certainly if we're looking at Punjab, returned servicemen played a big role in violence, you know, and brought their weapons back from the Second World War. So that all of these circumstances make it very difficult, you know, to have prevented this bloodshed and forced migration.
We have a question from Ahuja Teji. Thank you, Dr. Khan and Talbot, for a very great discussion. Malik Khizr Hayat Tiwana, a real rose between two thorns, Congress and Muslim League. How come you wrote a book on him and why he lost to the most corrupt and despicable Iftikhar Hussain and Khan Mamdouh? Who was it just because Punjabi Muslims got communalized by the Muslim League?
That's an interesting question. Obviously, my original PhD research was very much on the conflict between Muslim League and Punjab Unionist Party. And Kizza Tawana was the final sort of leader of the Punjab Unionist Party, and indeed the final Prime Minister of the United Punjab, although Punjab didn't have a Prime Minister in the final months of British rule. It was under direct governor's rule. It was what fascinated me about Tawana was the fact that he didn't fit national narratives, so nothing had been written about him. He was one of those people that until I did my biography, there was very little in terms of a detailed study of his career and his motivations. And I think that attracted me to writing about him. He was not liked in India because of the Unionists being opposed to Congress and being seen as a sort of anti-Congress force. He obviously wasn't liked in Pakistan because of the opposition to Muslim League. And for all those reasons, he didn't fit into national narratives of independence and partition. So it was for that reason that I wanted to try and explore something of his career and why it was indeed that he adopted the political stance that he did, and obviously why he stuck with that to the bitter end, whereas people like Mamdouh, mentioned in the question, were prepared to shift sides. And most of the Punjabi Muslim landlord elite eventually shifted sides to the Muslim League, whereas Tawana stayed with the unionist model. And I suppose why that policy happened from his perspective was that he was very much a Punjabi provincialist, first and foremost. He believed in the united Punjab. He saw partition as being something which would disrupt an economy and a social system, and also disrupt the Punjab's linkage with the army, which was something, again, which was quite dear to him. So for all those reasons, he looked at things from a Punjab perspective rather than an all India perspective. Whereas I think some of the other landowners who may have had more connections with the wider political world than Tawana had, his connections were with the British and with Punjab. And you could say that the British were encouraging him to maintain his unionist approach because they saw any disruption to Punjab as bringing instability, particularly during the war, but even in the aftermath of the Second World War. So Tawana, in a sense, clings on to a political way of operating, which is increasingly overtaken by events elsewhere. And of course, his whole position of loyalty to the British makes no sense once it's clear that the British are departing. And yet he clings on to that. And I think that helps to explain why it was that he became increasingly isolated as a figure in Punjab politics. But if you look at in detail at some of his warnings about what might happen if Punjab was divided in a particularly a way that didn't safeguard law and order and security, you can see that many of those warnings were very sort of accurate in terms of his understanding. So I don't pick the view which some people in Pakistan do. I know, and I've had this said to me, that why are you sort of supporting this person? He was stupid. He didn't realize what was happening. I think we have to see him much more as someone who was provincial in his approach and really wanted to do what he thought was best for Punjabis. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my personal views, on.
Absolutely. A good friend, Tarun, is here. Thanks for your incisive scholarship over the years. Could you comment on the situation of liminal groups such as Anglo-Indians, referred to by Manto in Toba-Texing, even the lunatics on both sides who were transferred across much later? Can the micro-historical perspective generated by the study of such liminal groups cast a fresh light on 1947?
I think in looking at liminal groups, as that question says, brings out yet again, this highly differentiated experience of partition, which I've already been referring to, and that groups and their identities didn't necessarily fit, within bigger narratives. And that their experiences as a result of that tell us something about partition itself. As far as Anglo-Indians are concerned, of course, Anglo-Indians were, I suppose, a bit like Kisutawana in a sense, associated with the British Raj, and when the British are going, what does that position mean? Where do they fit? Can they fit into Indian society or Pakistani society, or are they really a group which has to sort of leave? And of course, a lot of Anglo-Indians migrated from not only Punjab, but UP and elsewhere in India to Australia, and a lesser number to UK. Because they couldn't fit any more into a colonial system, which had given them a particular niche place, and they didn't have a position in an independent context. As far as the Anglo-Indians were concerned, some were also, of course, as members of the police service, particularly in Calcutta, in Bengal, and that in itself could lead to problems for them after independence, in terms of had they taken actions which were against the interest of a particular dominant politician, who is going to take revenge after independence. So their positions, they weren't just stereotypically working on the railways. They had all kinds of careers that they were engaged in. But the fit, where they fitted, I think is an important point. And the same with the lunatics. Where did they fit? Manto, the whole point of Talbot-Singh, is to raise this issue of a confused identity, and where does someone fit? In their ancestral village or in a place associated with their religious identity and community? What is the fit here? And are different sources of identity coming into conflict as a result of partition? Whereas a perhaps more straightforward narrative and reading doesn't talk about how conflicted individuals might have been, about their identity and where they wanted to be. Rather, it gives a straightforward, well, they're a Muslim, so they want to be with Pakistan, or they're a Hindu or a Sikh, so they want to be with India. So I think that's what Manto is sort of getting at, in that particular short story. Where is the root of identity? And is it simple and straightforward? And how confusing is it, indeed, to look at partition, in a non-binary sort of way. And I think that's what we can learn, from looking at these kind of liminal communities.
Thank you. Do we have okay, Maya Ahuja? What was the trigger for riots? What was the role of Hindu Mahasabha on the Indian side?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. the trigger for riots could be very different in different circumstances and contexts. That's the first thing. There's not one necessarily overall trigger. Obviously, it could be a political event, like Direct Action Day in Calcutta, in August 1946, for example. That could be a trigger. It might be something very different than that in a different locality. But there was this coming together, I suppose, of, as I say, long-term mistrust, motivations for wanting to repay old scores sometimes. A trigger could be in terms of wanting to loot a particular community, to state control over a particular locality. These kind of things, which were coming alongside of the higher politics of partition. And I think that's why the riots were so sort of intense and so difficult to control. There was a coming together of these kind of motivation. Hindu Mahasabha's role in this. I think that people probably associated with the Hindu Mahasabha, were engaged in violence, probably more so those associated with RSS, actually, than the Mahasabha. People who were in communal paramilitary organizations, in other words, would be likely to become involved in violence. That could be the Muslim League National Guards in the Pakistan side of the border, or it could be the RSS, or some of these Sikh sort of armies, Jattas that were organized. So the role of organization is important, and is something which recent scholarship has looked at. Was because sometimes violence was just seen as a sort of temporary madness, or a spontaneous outburst, and yet we know that there was also organization behind violence, and I think that that's an important nub, and something to look at and think about.
And there's plenty of blame to go around. I think, like whether even if it was
yes, that's right, plenty of blame.
or even organized. So I think, and be it on individuals, on communities, on even the states, that after partition there was never any attempt to bring or to prosecute any of the people who would perpetuate these things. Then in Pakistan, the so-called untouchables escaped the worst violence. They are the only significant Hindu community in Punjab now.
Yes,
that's a comment.
Obviously, if we look at Sindh, for example, where there is the main Hindu community in Pakistan, most of the people there are from that background. And it's certainly true, of course, that untouchables on the whole were less subject to violence than others. But also, of course, was this because they had less property to loot? If we're saying
that all tied in with the point that you made earlier on, with the economic position of that particular individual or group, and they had little to offer. So, despite the communal or the religious color which is given, I think on so many occasions, it becomes the material and the economics side which kind of played a determining role of whether a community or individual was, I think, was targeted. We have a question, last question, Nidhi's question. Please, maybe if you could bring that up, and then we will close. Anchal, if you could bring that up, please. There was a question by Nidhi. She'd, I think, asked the first question. Yes? No? I think our powers to be are deciding that. Okay, yeah. Thank you. You mentioned some Britishers too were uprooted as the impact of partition. Do you mean metaphorically or literally? I think. anyhow, the question
Yeah,
is.
I mean, there are probably about 100,000 British people in India at the time of partition. These were drawn from all different communities, from the military through the civil service, right the way down to people who were shopkeepers, people who, some of them were missionaries. Most of them returned to the UK, usually not in difficulties, but women who were married perhaps to Indians and who were abandoned by their husbands at the time of partition, they were sort of literally uprooted and had to return, sometimes with financial support from, as I say, the British High Commissions in the two countries. Sometimes people whose jobs were lost. These were people who weren't from the elite backgrounds, people whose jobs were lost as a result of partition, British people. They might have very little funds and resources to pay for shipping back to the UK, and those were other people. If you look at the records of the British High Commission, both in India and in Pakistan immediately after independence, you'll see cases of individuals approaching the High Commission for financial support. People perhaps who were ill, or people who, even British people who may have been mentally ill. What was going to happen to them? They couldn't be abandoned and left behind in India. They had to be brought back. So those were the British I was talking about, in terms of uprooting, as opposed to British people obviously going home, because they were in the civil service and they were retiring, or in the military and they were retiring.
Okay. Thank you so very much. First, I'd just like to thank Professor Talbot for a truly fascinating discussion. And it was a pleasure and an honor for us to have you speak on, which was, as I said, the last part of our season. This is like the 8th program that we've had. Thank you so much for this. Now, to the audience, thank you very much for tuning in. If you appreciate our oral history work and our mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations. As an NGO, in some countries, donations are tax-free. Links are in the description of this video. And again, just since this is my last event for hosting in this particular season, I would just like to thank 1947 Partition Archive for giving me this opportunity, and two people who've helped me immensely have been the silent and hardworking Anchal Singh, who's been providing all the background information, who was the person who got in touch, and who was someone who was helping all along, and the visionary and wisdom-laden hand and influence of Gunita Singh Balla. Thank you very much to both, and most importantly to the scholars who were able to take the time and speak with us, and to our audience who benefited and participated in this. So once again, this is Furrukh Khan saying namaste, good evening, sat sri akal, and assalamu alaikum from Lahore. Bye-bye.